Allison is, alongside these kind of essays and journal articles, Allison is also the author of a really wonderful monograph that I would recommend to all of you. Published in 2011, The Poetry of Kings, the Classical Hindi Literature of Mughal India, is, and I say this very genuinely, a path-breaking study of Braj literature during the early modern period. As with much of her work, The Poetry of Kings calls into question our comfort with modern conceptions of the relationships between particular courts and communities and particular traditions. By excavating the role of Mughal patronage in the vitality of Braj literature, Allison undermines in that book both common and scholarly wisdom on the history of Hindi literature. It's really a path-breaking book. It's a fantastic read, and I hope you'll all, if you haven't already had a chance to read it. Allison's talk today is entitled History as Elegy, the Poetics of Commemoration in Early Modern Hindi. Please join me in welcoming Allison Busch.
Thank you, Farina. I don't believe I've ever had a kinder introduction, and it's really very, very generous of you, and it's nice to know that I have a readership. One doesn't always know with courtly poetry. I will try to put this light on if I can. My eyes are at that stage where they stop working. Apparently it happens to us all at a particular age. So, as Farina just reminded me, there was a slight mistake that went out in my earlier title, and I realized that I actually kind of like it better. History as Elegy, well, there was a slightly the history of Elegy. Perhaps we can skip that, but I like the subtitle better. It was The Politics of Commemoration in Early Modern Hindi, and perhaps by the end of the talk I'll show you why I think that that's also a very useful way of thinking about my material. So I'm really, really happy to be here among friends and some new people that I've been very happy to meet. I'm trying to corral some of my thoughts into a new book, and it's about halfway done, and it's about the historical poetry of Mughal period India, and so I'd be very grateful for your insights, suggestions, critiques. Basically, I'm trying to put Hindi literature out there as a historiographical resource for Mughal India. When we think of Mughal India, we naturally think of Persian, and most of the documents we use are from the Persian tradition. Sometimes we supplement those with, European accounts of the court, and we're not unaware of the existence of Hindi sources. Certainly, Richard Sarin, Norman Ziegler. There have been many important studies on some of the textual heritage, documentary heritage of Hindi, but they've not, in my view, been adequately accounted for. So, basically, I assume you'll know something about I don't know whether this is a history audience, Asian studies audience, just transdisciplinary audience. So I will not speak to you as though you know the nitty-gritty of Mughal India. But, basically, the Hindi archives that I'm looking at come from the world of India's Rajput courts. And what we're talking about here, I'll forego the pointer, but if you see up in the western part of India, we have these very prominent regional courts that are all operating under the power shadow of the Mughal court in the early modern period. The rise of Hindi sort of textual culture, we could say, is closely associated with the rise of the Mughal state from the 16th century. And as I've indicated, these Rajput courts, they're very closely affiliated to the Mughal governance. They take up official positions within the Mughal imperial system. Their primary cultural languages are old forms of Hindi, like Braj Bhasha, the classical dialect. Dingle, we sometimes speak of this old Rajasthani dialect. There are other sort of sub-dialects, but this is what we're looking at here. And these, when we speak of Rajput officials, we often speak of them as mansabdars, as taking up official Mughal rankings. So this is the world that I've been studying and trying to bring into account. So as I've hinted, there are both sort of more documentary, quite a few documentary styles of Hindi historical genres. And here's just a basic list of, not exhaustive, of some of the types of materials that we have. Vigat, Bat, also called Vat, Khyat, Bahi. These are, people are starting to pay more and more attention to them. And again, Richard Sarin and Norman Ziegler have done, considerable groundwork. There's new work by Divya Cherian now at Princeton on the Bahi form. So I think we're seeing a more and more awareness of what the textual heritage has to offer. My own contribution, I hope, will be to bring the literary material more into view. So my own sort of interest veer towards the bottom half of this list. Charits, we have an enormous body of biographies of famous Rajput kings from this period. We have rasos, we can call ballads, prashasti, praise poetry, political poems. So these are just a few of the types of materials that we have. And I should add that I keep finding more and more in the archives, and that's not making this book any easier to finish. I keep trying to draw a line, and I keep saying, wow, and yet there's more. So, a challenge for me is where to sort of set the boundaries of this book, because clearly there's a lot of work still to be done. Some of the material, in fact, a good amount, is actually published. You can find little editions published in small publishing houses in Rajasthan. They don't have great circulation. They sometimes make it to our libraries. But there's, even within the textual, within the published corpus, there's actually quite a bit to work with. And then again, in the archives, one finds all kinds of other manuscript resources. So one thing we definitely need to bear in mind is that these texts, this kind of interest in documenting something to do with new state formations is very much, is taking place in Hindi, but it's also in dialogue with Persian traditions that are happening simultaneously. And I'll come back to that importance of thinking about the multilingual archive. So one issue that's loomed large in Mughal historiography, and one upon which the Hindi literary records shed light, is the problem of royal succession in a military culture that did not legislate primogeniture. So and I would say succession struggles were certainly the norm in this society, and Munis Farooqi has written a wonderful book on the princes of the Mughal Empire that, really tries to unpack that phenomenon. But there's one in particular that was attracted a lot of attention in Hindi literary writings, and that was the ousting of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan from power in a protracted war that began in 1657. So the victor of this succession struggle, Aurangzeb, is one of the most controversial Muslims in Indian history, and this fight for the throne sometimes takes on very stark civilizational overtones even today. In the standard historiography, Aurangzeb is seen to have cruelly murdered his brothers in a bloodthirsty coup. And particularly mourned in this narrative is Shah Jahan's heir apparent. So we have our Aurangzeb, we have our villain in the modern accounts, and we have Dar Shikoh, his brother, who's often posthumously revered in popular Indian history as a great philosopher and Sufi. and his death is thought to have heralded the end of a kind of tolerant Mughal ecumenicism. So there's been some revisionist work on this figure as well that one can be in dialogue with. So countless early modern Hindi writers refer to the Mughal succession conflict, and again, entire works are devoted just to the War of 16 that broke out in 1657, lasted through 1659, and I may just call it the War of 1658 to be concise about it. Rajput rulers were called upon to take sides, and entire families could be wiped out in a single battle. While Persian chronicles can take various stances, some are triumphalist, others are intent on glossing over difficult moments, they are naturally skewed towards imperial visions. Hindi literature, in contrast, helps us to better understand the Rajput experience of Mughal dynastic conflict. So in a single presentation, I can hardly do justice to this enormous corpus, despair of doing it in my book either, but I think today it's best if I just give you one account it's chosen from a number of accounts in the 17th and 18th century of this particular war in Hindi. The work is the Binhai Raso, The Tale of Two, by Mahesh Das. It's written in an old Rajasthani dialect that I referred to, Dingle. War was the stock and trade of Dingle poets, and constructing battle scenes, a craft that they perfected. And as often in Hindi historical poetry, we see a combination of stylized literary registers alongside more documentary impulses. And a close reading of this poetry of history allows us a ringside view of the War of 1658, and we meet up close some of the key participants. As far as the work itself, its patronage, as often in Indian literary history, we don't know that much about Mahesh Das Rao, the author. The editor of the printed edition, and I've not been able to verify this information yet, is one Saubhagya Singh Shekhawat, refers to records of land holdings in the poet's name, suggesting that the writing of elaborate war ballads was a lucrative pursuit in the 17th century, and it's nice to know that the humanities had, some money behind them at a certain point. Poetry was definitely the family business. We can track a brother, a nephew at the Mewar court. So there's some kind of circulation of these court poets, too, that we inadequately understand. There's a whole world of social history to be still thought through on these early modern poets. Mahesh Das, for his part, he was supported by the Gaur Rajputs. These are a small clan from place called Rajgarh, which is not on my map, but it's too small. But it's near Ajmer, if you can see, up beneath Marwar and the major states. It's close by there. So several of the Gaur Rajputs were important mansabdars under Shah Jahan, and I've been tracking a couple of key figures in some of the Persian sources as well, which I won't go into today. They came to the emperor's defense, Emperor Shah Jahan's defense in 1657 during his time of need. It's perhaps the case that Mahesh Das would have been present at some of the battles that he describes of the succession war. We sometimes think or hear of embedded journalists who are stationed to cover a war, and I think we can think about embedded poets as well who were on the scene. There's a kind of again, social history there that we don't fully understand. But I'm convinced more and more that early modern Hindi is very much part of a Mughal military culture that we also need to understand much better than we do. We think of the bhakti worlds, we think of the courts, the stationed courts, but there's also a lot of evidence for traveling poets working in the camps of major Mughal officials, as is the case with painting. But that's another story. So whether it's because he was there or not, Mahesh Das is intimately acquainted with the events of 1658. And at times he's a tireless chronicler of the names and clans and rankings of various warriors, as well as the strengths and failings of various people who never made it into the usual Persian sources. He knows who fought in the advance party, who was on the left and right flank. He may tell us that a particular battle happened on a Sunday, or exactly which officials met and in whose camp to discuss strategy. He's careful to indicate who was brave and who behaved like a coward. And as we shall see, he also has a special interest in enumerating the dead. So if I point here towards some of the ways in which Mahesh Das evinces the ethos of a historian, I should also say that there are times when just the norms of pre-modern Hindi textual discourse make it impossible for us to think of separating out documentary and literary registers. So within the span of a few lines, we can be moving from this painstaking detail to a kind of Dingle exuberance. He definitely, as a Dingle poet, wanted to tell a good tale, heighten his audience's interests. He would spin out various elements, create drama. I'll be able to give you, I hope, a small taste of that. And this was fully in keeping, we could say, with the emotional effects that were the very point of literature, at least according to traditional Indian rasa theory, a kind of structured system for articulating and understanding how emotion works in poetry. So in my work, I'm not trying to, to pull apart the documentary from the poetic. I think it's for me, it's very important in the book to give the poetry a real voice and to have the textures of that come across. So my approach is definitely more rooted in the discipline of literature than history. I think there's a lot we can do thinking through the themes of a text like this to understand what was at stake for the writer and the court that patronized him. I'm interested in how the court poets of Rajput rulers present the Mughal relationship, again, because we usually have the Persian side of the story. Now, what kind of political ethics are encoded in the worldview of this literature? Often, and again, if you go to too many sound and light shows in the Rajput courts of northern India, there's a sort of popular history that shows Rajputs, warding off the Muslim invaders, and it's very unnuanced discourse. And what we find in these texts actually is great nuance and a great, much sort of, we really have to. There's a lot of subtle understanding of all kinds of things, of religious sort of dynamics. I don't have time to do that in today's presentation, but in the book chapter that this is coming out of, I do look at some of the ways that sort of Hindu and Muslim soldiers are talked about, and certain types of groupings of identity that we can understand here. I'm curious also of to look at these texts for what they can help us see about emotional history, and because there is this kind of stirring of emotion that's at the very core of this poetic tradition. And Dingle poetry is also centrally about death and about making sure that people who died in war would live on in memory. As in many literary cultures, the death of soldiers in battle can spur admiration, and certainly some of this corpus is very much committed to an ethos of warrior masculinity. It celebrates, it sort of normalizes martial valor. But there's also other elements that we'll soon see. I mean, I'm curious to try to think through the world of warriors of this period, and these are again the really interesting sources for trying to get a bit of a handle on that world. It's a very complex task that Mahesh Das sets for himself in the work, and one definitely sees a kind of maybe a hesitation of some kind in the opening. Just this time, there's an elephant picture. That's for you. Yep. And we have a couple of just trying to show you some of the figures here. We've looked at Aurangzeb. We've looked at Darshiko. Now I sort of have to tell you more about the backdrop of this particular war. So it's called The Tale of Two, the Binhai Raso. but the war itself consisted of, many protracted battles, and there were more than two participants. So Shah Jahan fell ill in 1657, September, and rumors of his imminent death precipitated a crisis among his sons. Now Dara Shikoh was at the court, and he was the favored son who'd long been groomed for success. And he was sort of there in person and ready to take charge when this news broke out. His brothers took quick action to try to thwart his becoming emperor. And this is where we meet there are four sons, not two, and it's complicated what the two means in the Binhai Raso. So Shah Shuja struck from his base of operations in Bengal. Murad and Aurangzeb, stationed in Gujarat and the Deccan, respectively, teamed up for a period, but this alliance would fall apart. When Aurangzeb eventually won, he spared his father, although infamously kept him under arrest until his death in 1666. So Dara himself was murdered in 1659, Murad in 1661, and Shah Shuja disappeared in the early 1660s in Burma, his fate unknown. So this is sort of the backdrop of the work, and we now see how the poet introduces this kind of turmoil that he has to talk about. It seems like it induces a kind of grave discomfiture in the beginning of the work. There's an ominous note to the goddess Saraswati. O goddess Saraswati, giver of boons, grant me the wisdom and poetic means to describe how the armies of father and son clash. So that's right in the opening of the work. He then turns in a few verses to his guru. He's speaking about the Chagtais, the Turkish, the sort of clan that the Mughals descend from. Chagtai fought with Chagtai. The emperor lost his hold. O guru, give me the means to tell this tale at length. So we have a kind of lengthy opening and kind of a counterfactual moment, a vision of political stability in the opening. And perhaps the poet is trying to suggest with this verse I'm going to show you now that this is what should have been rather than what is. He tells us that Emperor Shah Jahan rules over the two communities, and it's a very interesting set of discussions in this text as a whole about the two paths, the two panths, the two rah, and so forth. So he rules over the two communities, head held high. Imperial horns sound in the east, the south, the north, and in the west. He has 4 sons, and lands have been assigned to each. Dara Shikoh maintains stability in the north. The eastern lands have been given over to Shah Shuja. No Aurangzeb to be the Shah over the south, and in the west they consider Shah Murad a force. 4 stable regions for 4 Chagtai princes. The 4 conduct themselves according to the 4 Vedas. Shah Jahan the Brave sits on the throne in Delhi. Both communities come together to serve him. So it's, again, a kind of counterfactual opening. We all know that this is going to fall apart right away, and I'm interested in how the text is, again, setting up sort of notions of political ethics. There's a traditional geographical imagining with a long history that's being played out in this verse. Traditional Indian kingships, the idea of the Digvijay, the conquering of the 4 directions. So there's sort of a balance in each of the 4 directions that's being presented there. Could have been an equitable distribution of power. So all of this is sort of a foil for what soon is going to happen. So after this opening, we suddenly get to a kind of action-packed scene, and we meet all of the contending Mughal princes, beginning with Shah Shuja. And here's where I want to just give you a small taste of the Dingle poetry itself. These lines are in the Tribhangi meter. It's got a characteristic triple fold, and it shows it's the first of the mustering of troops. Dingle poets love to describe forces coming together. So this is how we talk about Shah Shuja's army. And I'll see, I was actually in a Dingle poetry conference exactly a year ago in Jodhpur, and there were all these traditional performers invited to the event, and ever since then I feel ashamed to read aloud the poetry myself, because it was so dramatic and it was so marvelous. But let me just see if I can get even a fraction of what the real performers can do with this, and with my failing eyesight, but I'll do my best. So listen for these triple folds. Suja sulitanam, oha amanam, jamni jawanam, jamaranam. Kind of scrambled a bit. Jawanam, jamaranam. Aramba umange anga suange tanga turange talanam. Pakarala pamangam naga sanagam bahi bihanga banasam. Gajachampa sajaggam dhare dhajjam uri sarajja akasa. There are hundreds of verses like this in the poem. You don't have to clap. But this is just a wonderful example of Dingle stylistics. Each line has these sort of 3 clipped phrases, and they're set off by alliteration, internal rhyme. It's a brief pause for emphasis at the end. So this helps to create this sense of movement and danger, as though we can hear Shah Shuja's forces just galloping in. And just verses later, we then are suddenly in the Deccan. So there's a real sort of storyteller at work here. We suddenly meet Aurangzeb's messengers, and it's interesting to show how just versatile these poets were. Suddenly we need to be in the Deccan, and we have Aurangzeb consulting with his spies, and the poet uses a different form, which is called vachanika. It's a Rajasthani genre. It has a lot of Persian it's a kind of Persian prose piece that's in the middle of the poem. And, again, there may not be, people here who, you don't need to know Persian to understand that this is a very sort of kind of a mimicking of a Persian Mughal register. And maybe we'll just do a little bit of this one in the original too. So, Delhi ke Kasi dakshin ko dhaye, Jahanabad seti roja chari mein Aurangabad aaye, Kasido he andri bulao ye farmaya, tabe Kasid hajuri aaya, sarja kari ukil ne basta gudraya, tis nisti mein ye khabari aaye, sahi jahan pati sahi bapati paaye. So the Delhi messengers rushed to the Deccan, reaching Aurangabad from Shah Jahanabad in 4 days. Aurangzeb ordered the messengers to attend upon him. They made obeisance, and then the court official had the document read out. In it was the news that Shah Jahan was gravely ill. So we see a kind of conjuring up of the world of the Mughal daftar, of the bureaucracy of the Mughal state, and it's a kind of maybe a bit of documentary authority on the part of the poet that he's using this particular register in this scene. We begin, there's just a lot of bustle, and we begin to feel this sense of foreboding as the preparations for war are underway. And there's a kind of cataclysmic, kind of ominous feeling, and I think it's, if you wanted to ask yourself, what better choice of imagery would there be than the storied battlefield of the Mahabharata to convey a deep sense of unease about an impending war between brothers? And sure enough, Mahesh Das drives home this point with a pointed couplet that compares the imminent battle of Ujjain in the succession war with the fields of Kurukshetra. In this manner, the forces of Delhi were stationed at Ujjain. A war would now ensue, as at Kurukshetra with the Pandavas, says the poet. So again, it's part of a sort of stately pausing, and a verse like this, a short verse, often is a stately pause in early Hindi poetry. And then we have, I just want to give you a few tastes of some of the critical moments. There's one that I really like, is another Vachanika from this same part of the work where there's a lot of bustling and moving back and forth, trying to make preparations for war. We have Aurangzeb and Murad approach the Rana of Mewar, Udaipur, and they ask for assistance. And I'll show you, this is Mewar in western India. So this too comes in the form of a highly Persianized document. Prince Aurangzeb and Prince Murad wrote a letter. The imperial throne of Delhi was bestowed by the Ranas. If the Shah of Delhi sits on it, it is because the Rana seats him. That is how he gets his title, Badshah of Delhi. Might we have just a little help from His Excellency? Could Udaipur come to the aid of Aurangzeb and Murad and help us fight the forces of Delhi? So this is quite improbable to have the Mughal princes reaching out to the Ranas of Mewar, who are the refractory Rajputs in Persian discourse. It's certainly a refreshing change of perspective, and it shows you how Hindi court poets may foreground Rajput perspectives on Mughal political life. And it makes good sense, given the patronage of this work, that the Gaur Rajputs in particular would be given special attention. They were, as I said, known as Shah Jahan loyalists, and they're often sort of celebrating a strong service ethic to the empire. So at one point, so just now I'll pull out a few examples of how this particular Raj, you've got your most powerful Mewar community that's been brought in. But here's these are small guys, these Gaur Rajputs, sort of not in the same category as Jaipur or the Amer, the sort of big Jodhpur, the big kings. But nonetheless, they're given very sort of meaty roles in the text. So now I'm taking us to, so we've got Aurangzeb marching up from Aurangabad. He's going to go up past Burhanpur, which you see on your map. Not on the map is a fort called Aser, or sometimes Asirgarh in modern Hindi. And it's just north of Burhanpur, and I know this because I was just there. I saw, it's a long story why I was in Burhanpur, but I was, and I saw a sign and it said Asir Fort. I said, oh my God, it's 4 hours away. We have to go there. That's in my book. And so, sure enough, we went there, and there it is, rather impregnable, sitting there on the road, on the Deccan Road, coming back up towards Ujjain, where one of the major succession battles was fought. So this is where my Gaur Rajputs come into view in a particularly important way in the text. Aurangzeb tries to get the Gaur Rajputs to give up this fort. They're stationed there, and they're Shah Jahan's loyalists. And there's a little bit of dialogue that I'll share with you. So Aurangzeb spoke angrily thus: "Fierce Gaur, give up the fort. There are great advantages to joining me. I will give you a considerable mansab. If you don't agree, I will storm the fort and kill you." But Man Singh Gaur will have none of it. He is loyal to his king. He says, "Listen, Sultan Aurangzeb, Emperor Shah Jahan has kept me as his soldier. Progeny of demons, you can break my skull, but the fort of Aser will never be broken." And tutisi sisa suram tana tabi asera natutasi. So it's a kind of little alliteration and kind of powerful in the Hindi. So there's a certain Asuram Tana is a kind of demonizing vocabulary in the Indian moral imaginary, and that's pulled out in full force here. We have all kinds of ventriloquized speeches of this type that show the steadfastness of the Gaur Rajputs. I have a dramatic one from Arjun Gaur, one of who's on the verge of his death. There's going to be a dramatic death scene. He's about to go out in battle, and he's going to die along with all of his soldiers. But he first says, "My father used to impart this lesson. Once you engage in combat, never flee. This is the way of our family. Thus a son proves to be a worthy son. From birth my name has been Arjun, of Mahabharata fame. I will make Ujjain Kurukshetra and obtain salvation by my sword." So a lot of dramatic, as I said, ventriloquizing in this text. What else? What other moves does my poet make that I want to share with you? He often So we see this sort of gaur valor is, of course, a major theme, standing up for the emperor. He's also very interested in the distinction between those who do their military service properly and those who don't cut it on the battlefield. He has a category that he uses called the bhajiyan, the bhagne wale, the people who run away from battle. And you can't necessarily blame them. These were pretty brutal wars. There's just these there's sort of scenes where people turn back, and there's a particularly bad case that's detailed in the work is when Maharaja Jaswant Singh, shown here on your right, is said to have wilted Murjaya on the battlefield, and he turned back, and it was an infamous step, and it's again it's about the worst thing you can do in the moral imaginary of this text. There's also, it's handled a little bit more delicately, but Dara Shikoh himself is also shown to be turned back. He's sort of told to do so by a commander, and that's a little bit better than just wilting. But the idea is he didn't stay; that he actually went back to the comfort of the fort. So here I'm trying to think about the kind of normative emotions that a text like this inscribes, the warrior ethics of Rajput, and how these of Rajput worlds, and how these are inscribed by sort of positive and negative example. But even if that valor is there, and it's certainly one key theme that the poet explores, he doesn't fail to tell us that these wars are simply awful, and 2 out of 3 of the major battles of this war were complete routs for Shah Jahan's forces, massive casualties. And so we also get a kind of reflection upon that loss and in the poetry. And here's an example. It's called Bibhacha Barnan, the account of revulsion. It's a kind of effective technique, which you can see a little better in the Hindi, which I won't read, but over and over the poet says, kahun parai, somewhere there lies, sort of lies fallen, over and over in the original. So we get these sort of ghastly scenes, here lie the fallen heroes, their bodies dismembered, the trunks of fearsome elephants severed. Oh, more elephants, Tom. Strewn about are tusks, mired in gore. Vultures and jackals roam the battlefield. The finest warriors lie fallen, their swords stilled. Some soldiers have fallen from their mounts and lie writhing like fish. Here lies one solitary soldier. Here are 2. Here is a severed arm. There limbs are entangled. Here is a wheel. Over there a vehicle. This is a fairly it's a bit of a stock scene. One can find such scenes as opposed to more descriptive one. But there are also more sort of personal ones, and again, just trying to show how this would feel, a kind of long, repetitive incantation of loss, that goes, and sometimes these go on for pages and pages as in a single verse that's a little too long for me to communicate to you here. But there's also a kind of cataloging of the dead that takes place in dramatic ways. And here's just one example, again, using some of the technique of repetition. Fallen in battle was Birabhadra, who lost his life. Fallen in battle was the famous warrior Murari. Fallen were Raj Singh and his brother Man Singh, and the kinsmen Shyamdas and Kushalesh. Fallen was chieftain Kishandas Patalot. Fallen was soldier Shyamdas, warrior of Ajmer. And again, this goes on for line after line after line. So, we don't just take away this message of the glory of war. There's also a great pathos and this sense that these were not faceless wars, but peopled by Rajput soldiers who were bound to each other and to imperial authorities through these ethical codes of service. And it's this kind of immortalization of many of these names that ends up being one of the final products of a work like this. Shall I move to wrap up-ish? 5-ish? Yeah? Okay. So let's just go back for a moment and remind ourselves that Persian, right, was the language of the Mughal Empire, but many early modern Indians were and are multilingual, and certainly this is true of the historical record. In a society characterized by multiple languages and textual cultures, it's simply stating the obvious to say that these multiple genres and registers of history were in play and served diverse constituencies. So I've argued in other work that, and Farina referred to it in Poetry of Kings, that Hindi textual culture of this period was fully accessible to elite Mughal society and in fact was greatly supported by it. Dingle is a little different from Brajbhasha, and which was the more, Brajbhasha was the mainstream classical dialect. This is a more, has more local currency in Western Indian communities. We don't have a good reception history of early modern poetry in India, period, but it seems certainly possible to imagine the function of a work like the Binhai Raso in its textual community. I mean, if the poem of Mahesh Das was commissioned by a local Rajput chieftain from the Gaur clan, it seems likely it was performed for the survivors, families, friends of the many heroes who died in a grueling imperial war. The soldiers fought bravely for dharma, for the emperor, as well as for the glory of their family and community, and their sacrifices were not forgotten. So in this sense, I think of the Binhai Raso as an act of commemoration on the part of the community. Perhaps it's a kind of early modern textual version of a war monument with the lists of names over and over and over again. Certainly a text like this has a less material and perduring presence than a war monument. It survived on ephemeral paper, but it also survived as part of a vibrant oral culture. Many genres in India were performed in this period. They're part of the repertoire of bards who had amazing skills in recitation and memory in transmission. I showed you just a tiny fraction above of some of the amazing kind of oral atmospherics that we see in these performed works. And again, I stress too the sort of somber moments that ennoble death with meaning. This is where I've been starting to think of the history as elegy motif, and it seems worth noting that in this text it's always, that the Gaur Rajputs are always named. Important Shah Jahan warriors are named. Aurangzeb's, Murad's, Shah Jahan's armies are much less likely to attract specific description. Of course, it may be that Mahesh Das is simply not familiar with the details, but I feel that naming is an act of empathy and it helps to build community. So by collectively remembering and by inculcating normative emotions, by establishing the parameters of honor and dishonor, Hindi historical poetry helped to constitute its Rajput patrons and listeners, maybe as some kind of emotional community, if I could use Barbara Rosenwein's term. I think the Binhai Raso must also be seen as an attempt to mold the self-perception of local political groups as indispensable to the functioning of empire. And while recognizing the need to assess sort of competing claims of different historiographical subgroups in the subcontinent, the discursive convergences between imperial and local worldviews are considerable. And I think this merits more attention too. Sometimes we, again, it's the sound and light show sort of register, but we assume that, Hindi texts about Rajputs will be, promoting a different sort of vision from that of the imperial histories. That's true and it's not true. I think there are certainly ways, and we saw the Rana of Mewar being celebrated in particular ways, but these works are very much about imperial service too, and that's the register we see in Persian chronicles from the period. So I think convergences also need to be noted. Here, it's just a kind of passing reference, but if you read the hundreds of verses in this work, you notice how gores are discussed in the text. And so we see a kind of imperial service ethos when they're discussed as the pillar of Delhi, holding up the Mughal regime. But you also see these interesting little ways in which their kind of local place of Ajmer is noted. They are the sort of hero of this particular place from which that community hails. So I'm interested in history as elegy. I'm interested in a kind of local inscription of particular types of authority, articulating the values, the valor of particular social groups like the gores. There's also some element of counter-history. I've alluded to an example or two, but perhaps most of all in the end, how we get there is a very long and complicated process. But we know the outcome of 1658, a resounding defeat for Shah Jahan and his son Dar Shikoh. But Mahesh Das doesn't end his work quite like that. He chose to close his narrative on an earlier moment in the war. It's an initial victory over Shah Shuja by Shah Jahan's forces, rather than taking the narrative to the bitter end. And his last canto gives special prominence to another Gaur chieftain, one Anirudh Singh, who manages to achieve a victory for his general in this campaign. So Anirudh Singh is escorted to the imperial court, and the emperor's son Dar Shikoh praises him extravagantly. And he says, "I am victorious because of you. I will rule, but you have given me the empire. Fateh tum se hum paaye, patisahi hum kare, tume dini patisahi." So again, ultimately, Dar Shikoh lost the empire to his brother Aurangzeb, but in some ways, poetry is better than history. In Mahesh Das's text, the Gaur Rajputs get the last word, and Mahesh Das's construction of the situation, as with Aurangzeb's overture to Rana Raj Singh of Mewar earlier in the work, the construction is that imperial power is only possible because of Rajput military service. If the Mughal wars could not be lost or won without clans like the Gaur Rajputs, and again, it's very much the claim of this work, the Rajputs possess an undeniable, indispensable authority, and these were claims that were best made in the Hindi record. We miss an important voice in the historiography of the period if we fail to take account of them. Thank you. Sure. And if you think of anything after that you want to tell me, there's my email address. I really am in that place in the middle of a book where I'm trying to see my way through to close it. So yes, Christy.
I'm interested in hearing more about what you think about patronage, because I know that was something that was really interesting in your first book, and it seems really significant. I don't know, does this particular poet name his caste? I know the little bit I've done in that work that there are different kind of court poets that have different roles. I wonder if that was true here.
It's a really useful question. We know really not very much about this author or his brother or the nephew, but I think there's some that we could try to reconstruct. there's often a caste differentiation between charans, say, and bhats. So that's one of the distinctions. And these are bhats, if that means something to you. On the genealogical side. But I think some of the ways we think about those categories, I think also can be further examined. What do we do in the absence, as so often is the case, of the real data that can tie a person like this down? I think I can try to follow up on if those land records exist, I suppose I could try to follow up on that. I'm still trying to figure out something about Gaur patronage, because they do have, if there's a built environment to be discovered, then one might be able to turn there. I think trying to read the works of the brother, unfortunately these are extremely, the reason this book takes so long, as I was saying to Madhumita earlier, these works are extremely dense and complicated and multi-months to really get your head around one of them. And so I have it on my to-do list to work on the ones from the Mewar side, and maybe that would help reconstruct a bit of a family lineage. But it's often a challenge to find out more than we know, more than this brief sort of indications they give us about family. But, I've surmised, again, he knew these people, he knew everybody, he knew every little name and patronymic, so he's part of them, and maybe he was part of, the traveling sort of military camp as well. Surmise for now. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
What I've seen of the way that these are used is that there's multi-generational commentary, so that, I really liked the examples there. I think it's more than the Mahabharata. It could be that the genealogist is taking his great-great-grandfather's names that have been passed down to make a commentary on a present-day situation. I would hear that would happen. It seems like that your examples look like, that might be happening.
That's a wonderful, wonderful insight. In fact, I'd like to get my pen so I can note something down. I can. Thank you. Sure. I was saying at lunch that one often gets interesting comments and reflections at these events, and then the key thing is to be able to go back to the book chapter and make sure they get in there. So,
thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and for reciting. It was lovely. You got the meter, and I had a couple of thoughts that came up. Some of the poetry you showed us, it has a lot of terms which are drawn from, Hindi tradition, like large, then naat, dilli, thumb, etc. And I was just wondering if you have examples of some Persian terms in these texts, because obviously this is, is there a real syncretism going on, or is he remaining firmly within this? Similarly, the notions he uses, well, you mentioned dharma. So I'm wondering if there are, references to sacrifice. So what are the terms they use? Like, are they close to the Hindi terms, or is there something particularly specific within that poetic tradition?
It's a wonderful question, and how we think about register, if we can call it that, in early modern poetry is it's really worth exploring. If you think of the root of some of these words, like dharma or natha, of course it's Sanskrit, and there are classical registers when you invoke the Mahabharata. So some of this is really going back to a particular early vision. I tried to show some way that the Mughal emperors were being shown as kind of Digvijay, as mastering the four directions. So these are old political vocabularies, but at the same time, the fact that this is Hindi and it's not Sanskrit and it's also not Persian, but it can draw from different places, and it's far more hybrid as both a lexical sort of stock as well as it's in terms of its thematics. And so there are definitely Persian bureaucratic terms, the descriptions of weapons and certain things come out of a variety of sort of both sides of things. It's very hard to say what is just Hindi.
But it's interesting to see
Yeah.
that they are using those Persian terms for, weapons, obviously for ranks.
Right.
Yeah, but like if it's
Yeah.
being integrated, assimilated,
Mhm.
think about, honor.
Yeah.
things
The
like that.
words the words for honor are Indic, and there's a notion of Swami Dharma. Cynthia Talbot's written about that, and she has a wonderful book coming out actually on the Prithviraj Raso, which is really an iconic Raso text that's helping. That was a text that people had in mind, I think, when they wrote their own Rasos. So Swami Dharma is a notion that's there in this earlier sort of Rajput vision as well. It's this service to one's overlord no matter what, and being willing to die. And so I think it's significant that some of these terms come up in that kind of a non-Persian register, perhaps we could say. It's useful to think about it.
Well, from what I can remember of the Persian chronicles on these accounts, there's often a great deal of emphasis on sort of signs towards the victor, like astrological or cosmic sort of signs. Do you see anything like that in these Hindi depictions?
Wonderful question. It's not significant in this text, and I thank you for pointing that out because it will be useful to think about it. I'd have to go and double check, but I think there is certainly an astrological, there's checking about dates and when you're going to depart for battle and times of day, and I think that's fairly standard, but not a sense of who is destined. There's not, or who has been pointed by God or by this above. It's a wonderful observation.
Thanks, Allison. So this was amazingly rich, and I'm trying to kind of put the pieces together, and it seems to me that there are multiple challenges with this sort of work. One is just actually, it seems like you're doing work around these genres and trying to give us a sense, and it sounds really evocative, like the stuff you're doing around thinking of it as an emotional community and the ethics of kind of warrior ethics coming out. So, but I'm trying to step back and think about this from a historiographical kind of point of view, and I'm just thinking, I mean, as you know, I'm not an early modernist, but I do think that's where some of the best work in South Asian history is happening. And one of the things that I thought was so immensely helpful about your first book was actually, I think, collapsing what has been a kind of dominant paradigm in Mughal historiography of understanding a relationship between Mughal and Rajput, right? But always maintaining this careful distinction, right? And I think what your work on patronage of the Braj Pasha literature actually collapsed that in ways that was, really effective. But I guess with this work, what I'm trying to think about is, I totally agree that one would, that Mughal historiography is limited by its emphasis on Persian. But what I'm trying to figure out more is what these texts are telling us about Mughal historiography, right, rather than a kind of Rajput. Like in the sense that I think what you've always done so effectively is actually not limit these texts, and I guess I'm having a little bit of difficulty, trying to make that jump here to think about how does one think about these texts as giving us both insights into a particular Rajput culture and simultaneously understand what they're doing for our understanding of Mughal history and historiography, more importantly.
Well, I
right?
think it's one way to address that is to say this was a war. This is a war that has a particular status in Indian historiography, the War of 1658, and it doesn't look at all like that from the point of view of around 1660 when this was written. We don't see any kind of, it's, again, I'm using more of a popular historiography rather than the more scholarly one, which now sees Dara Shikoh as a much more complicated figure. He was somebody who, his lack of military bearing was critiqued at the time and so forth. And that's something we need to understand about, we can't just say, Aurangzeb, the cruel Orthodox Aurangzeb murdered the Sufi poetry lover, philosopher, right? And so none of that vision is part of this world. So I think that's one way to think about is, this is a turning point in the historiography somehow, and this is a pretty, as far as I can tell, pretty soon after 1658. So we can see it at a moment. We can take a little bit of a snapshot there, and I think that's one way of sort of reflecting back what Mughal power looks like. And certainly the way that Shah Jahan is the Swami, if you have dharma, Swami dharma, your Swami is Shah Jahan, and so that's real investment in these warrior communities in their Mughal leader is something worth thinking about more. In another chapter of the book, I study two biographies of Man Singh, and they're written around the time of the Akbarnama, almost exactly. It's 1585 and 1595. And so although the work is about Man Singh and Man Singh's court, and it's giving a certain local attention to, this is our leader, it also reflects back on the Mughals too. And there's a subsection called the Akbar Charita inside the Man Charit, and where we see portrayals of Akbar and what his rule looks like to this Rajput court at this moment. So I think I haven't done it as much, it's not been as much of an emphasis today, but I think that's one of the ways that these texts can tell a different story from the imperial chronicles and give us ways in what does just power look like. And Akbar makes the cut. And there were some verses here about Shah Jahan that, we're thinking about how he rules and the political ethics that encodes. So I think it, what I'm hearing from you, and I think it's very helpful, is to try to make that more explicit, what we have to gain by inserting that story into the picture, and that's very helpful.
Thanks very much. I have one question that I just want some elaboration on, and a couple comments. Could you just speak more about what a raso is? I mean, I liked your original comments that we're not going to worry whether it's documentary or literary, things like that. Leave the genre question aside, but then the whole interpretive effort seems to be to relate this somewhat to some notion of history, and that's in your title too. And I don't know what that is, and Marathi, is this anything in relation to Rahasya? I mean, what is the sense, what kind of text or thing is a raso? And then I have one or two other questions.
Okay. It's, as many literary history questions are, it's complicated. I can't claim to say what the Jains do or what Apabhransha or certain earlier traditions have done. In this world, the raso is typically a martial genre, and it's specifically about tales of war, and so that's the parameter in which one looks at it.
What does a word mean? Does it relate to anything else we would know, or is it just this? It's just a term for this particular form.
I don't know if it's related to, say, the Rasika, which is an earlier literary
There are
form.
Marathi genre called
Yeah.
rahasyas, which
Oh,
are usually entertainments or
Yeah,
something.
no, that's a different.
That's a
That would be a
different-
different
it's
route
not- it's just
altogether.
together.
Yeah, but
Uh,
it's good to clarify one's
Anyway,
terms.
in response to what you were saying, I mean, you presented this as elegy,
Yeah.
and yet most of what I found in what you presented wasn't lamentation or mournful. It's much more celebration and heroic. At least that's the sense I got.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had another part that was going to be elegiac or whether this really isn't an elegy at all. That was one thing. Second, related to the astrology question, besides the mention of Saraswati at the beginning, are there gods that run through this tale? And I mean, that would also suggest something about the perspective that was going on there. But let me just leave it at that.
I'm sorry I didn't give you more elegy. It's a question of that sort of bursting out from a chapter when you want to share this and you want to share that. And you know, the title I think I was asked to give last July, and it still sort of works. You know? But it ends up being that here's the you know, it's a lot more than elegy, but I think that is one of the moves of the text. And you know,
without the defeat. It ended in a victory,
which Yeah. also
suggests it's not really elegy.
yeah, that's a good point. I accept that. So they are. There are these really interesting moments of religiosity among the warriors, and they know they're going to die, and we know they're going to die, and so these dramatic scenes where they're preparing to do so. So you'll have a battalion leader like Arjun Singh Gaur. You know, he'll give a speech to his troops, and it's almost a bit Bhagavad Gita-like, you know, that sort of Kshatriya, you must fight. But then you catch him in a private moment, putting on a kind of robe and there's Ganges water and a kind of invocation. So there's some kind of private religious scene that we witness, which is quite fascinating. And then the text will also turn to warriors, and it's not on the other side. You know, it's Muslims within Shah Jahan's army, and they too have their ritual practices. A little bit of they're doing some prayer, and so I think it's very sensitive that there is kind of sadness there, as in these moments when you too are forced to consider what they're about to go through, and it's very moving and very lovely. I wasn't able to share that part with you here. This text doesn't have, you know, a god coming from up above. One of the Mansingh wars, one of the Mansingh scenes in the texts I just referred to in it from a different chapter, you have Devi coming to the Rajput warrior on the battlefield and saying, "Bravo, bravo," and you deserve to win. So there's and that's a fairly common motif, actually. It's wonderful questions.
I've followed your works very closely. I love your book and your writings. I'm in music, and so as you know, most of the poetry is in Braj Bhasha. I was just, and I love the way you've evoked the Braj Bhasha world. I was just wondering how and why you've moved to Dingle, and yeah, that might be in the introduction of your book, but I'm personally very curious. Yeah.
Wish I could just stay with Braj Bhasha. It's so much easier. So when I worked on Poetry of Kings, and the really early work there came out of the court of Orcha, and that was a particular court in central India. It was a very useful court for thinking about how a Rajput relationship is built with the Mughals and how that plays out over several generations, and connecting that to literary and political culture. And that was a much narrower focus in the early days of my work, say as a PhD student. It was one court, it was Keshav Das, and then as the work started to develop, you suddenly realized that at that court in Orcha, I think they're actually copying in some ways what Amer is doing. I can see references to that same Man Singh. So there's a way that these people are all meeting up in Agra or meeting on military campaigns. These Rajputs are in part of this larger community. And then it no longer seemed wise to consider, especially for the more political concerns of this book, to consider this literary culture without factoring in, a huge amount of material from these more Western dialects. And they're not hopeless for those who know Braj Bhasha. Some verses are very similar, and sometimes the language is, I don't think they knew, if this makes sense. I mean, it's not as though people said, well, I'm going to write this in Braj Bhasha and I'm going to write this in Rajasthani. I think language is evolving, and the way that Braj became this very standard dialect, it hadn't yet happened especially in the early part of the 17th century. And so they're kind of intermingled is a shorter way of saying that.
I was just fascinated by the way the tale ends, and thinking about it as a modernist historian. And it reminded me of an essay that William Cronin wrote about the Dust Bowl, showing how, depending on where you start and where you end the story, you can come up with very different interpretations of that history. One question, is that common? That is, that you start with a sort of generic, stability and the four directions, and something is looming. Are there foreshadowings throughout the text which assure you that the writer already knew the end that we all have come to learn in our standard history, or was the writer perhaps killed in battle? I mean, is that even a remote possibility? Yeah, I guess just that. I mean, that would be a very striking fail, to end the story there if you were a modernist.
It's a great question, Will. He describes events that happened later as well, and so that's what makes the dying in battle less likely that's just where he ended it. The other interesting thing, and I haven't figured out why, precisely the scene that you mentioned, the one of stability, of that just opening with Shah Jahan, and here are the four sons. He actually repeats that scene in canto. It opens canto 1, and then it opens the last canto, and there are about 20 or so verses that repeat verbatim. And so that seems to me some kind of a literary strategy, weaving that back in as though he really wanted to emphasize it. But I've never actually seen that before, where a poet has, it may suggest something of the performance context. There's a single manuscript, as far as I know, of this text, something about transmission, but it's puzzling. It's puzzling to me. It's not the only text where the end point is strategic. We can put it that way. That's a typical move in these worlds, I find. But I like your way of thinking about it.
Speaking of the Dust Bowl, I've been picking up on the ways in which the Mahabharata is explicitly but also implicitly invoked. by the practice of the poet, including the dust of the army setting out. This is a very, very old
It's an
trope.
old image, very
You know, what I call a
standard,
din
yeah.
and dust picture
Yeah.
of the noise, the brilliance, and the dust created by the army. I'm curious about one thing that I didn't hear. In the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, in the Arthashastra, armies take up certain formations at the beginning of battle, and then there's the melee, and they all, disappear. But they have these vyuhas, they're called, formations, and this doctrine of vyuhas was apparently very important. I find examples as far away and as recently as Java in the 1500s, Thailand in the 1800s. And what I've never been able to discover, I haven't been able to find any literature that describes what happened to this in the Mughal period or even the Turkish period, whether this tradition survived, got melded with something else, with Persian doctrines of battle formations or what have you. Can you shed any light on this?
So there are no vyuhas in this text, but there are some words that I didn't know, and there are a couple of different words for the vanguard, and that's a normal kind of, we hear about vanguards a lot in Raso literature. But what was interesting to me in this text, and I don't have the words off the top of my head, but it seemed like there were 4 or 5 different words for side, like flanking sides, but they're not at all related to, they're not derivative of Yuha in any particular way. So I don't know what military tradition that's coming out of, but it's very, very specific. And right side, back center. So there definitely, and this was the sort of specific information that the poet had, that these people were in this part of the army. And so, again, suggests something with names and commanders, that there was, some kind of knowledge, a very close knowledge of the events.
So maybe I'm going to take the prerogative to make this a last question.
Sure.
You don't necessarily have to answer it, but I think it comes back to something that both Will and Lee have hinted at, which is this question of the genre and thinking about the Raso and what's going on there. And I think both you and I take the question of genre really seriously, but the thing that's been kind of in the back of my mind percolating is, you said that the Raso is kind of a martial tradition and often focused on battle, right? And I'm thinking about, of course, this Punjabi genre of the Jungnama, and I've actually never studied it explicitly, but there is this one 1849 really important one, right? Jungnama Hind Punjab Di. But it makes me wonder that the question of what the genre is, irrespective of what the content is, right? So if we think about the Mahabharata, it's an itihas, right? Not a Jungnama, not a Raso. But I guess maybe in a way, the question, it's not a question, it's really more a comment to think about maybe in relation to some of these other South Asian literary traditions that have similar content but identify themselves very differently, might be an opportunity to think about what is really specific to the Raso in a way.
Yeah, I think it's a very helpful suggestion, and I will also add that there's a Rajpasha Jungnama on, it's the war between Farrukh Sir and Jahandar Shah, so it's written around 1713. So I need to understand how that fits in with this Punjabi
I was
book.
just I was thinking, like, I know this famous Jungnama from the mid-19th century, but I actually don't know very much about that genre in Punjabi and where it was coming from. But clearly, I should be doing some more work to think about that, because it's a really interesting genre. But it does speak to this issue of, kind of elegy, celebration, what's being celebrated. It certainly seems like certain things are being valorized, might be the right word, and certainly some things are being lamented in that broad genre.
Yeah. I think it's useful just reminder that elegy is not part of the genre sort of description, and that's not, even though that may be the mood of some of the poetry. So that's helpful.
Allison, thank you so much for
Thank
sharing your
you.
work with us.